At the end, we have one of our biologists here, Stephanie Schottmeyer, and she is going to tell us all about Florida's coral reefs.
So, first of all, did you know that corals are animals? Corals first evolved here on Earth over 565 million years ago, which means that corals are actually older than the dinosaurs. And corals are called cnidarians. That means that corals are related to jellyfish and anemones. And just like jellyfish, corals have stinging cells that are called nematocysts. And those cells are used for protection and capturing food. Now, life as a coral starts out very, very small. So as you can see here in this photo, this adult coral actually releases its gametes, which are eggs and sperm, into the water column most of the time during the night, during certain times of the year. And those gametes mix in the water column and create these tiny little larvae. Now, these larvae swim throughout the water column for any time from a couple of days to maybe a week or so, and then they settle onto the surface of the reef or to the bottom of the ocean, and they form these little tiny organisms, which are what we would say are baby corals called spat. Now those spat then start to metamorphosize, and they become what we would recognize then as a polyp. Now, a polyp is an individual coral. So a single coral animal is called a polyp. So you can see here, this little polyp kind of looks like an anemone, so you can see how they're kind of related. Now, a polyp would then kind of clone itself. And together, after it cloned itself many, many times, they would form a colony. So a coral colony would then grow. So all of these polyps are genetically identical to each other, and that colony would grow over time. Now, most corals create their own skeleton. So that's how a coral colony grows. They create their own calcium carbonate skeleton. And over time, that's how they slowly build the structure of a coral reef. So a coral reef is basically the building of coral skeleton over time. Now, corals grow very slowly, which is only a few centimeters or about an inch a year. So most coral reefs are 5,000 to about 10,000 years old. So imagine starting as that tiny little larvae, how long it takes for a coral to actually become a colony, and then how long it would take to become an entire coral reef. Now, some reefs are so large that you can actually see them from space. So if you think of coral reefs like the Great Barrier Reef that's in Australia, if you look at this picture here, the reef here that's kind of these little green, you can see the green outline here that's circled in the yellow. This is the coastline of Australia. This is the Great Barrier Reef, and there are so many corals that have covered so much area that you can see this coral reef from space. So just think about how much time it took for this coral reef to grow. So now we've mentioned Australia, and Michelle mentioned that we have corals here in Florida. So where in the world are coral reefs found? And if you look at this map of the world here, the line that goes straight across the center is 0 degrees. That's the equator. Now, most coral reefs are found between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. So all of the areas here in orange are where coral reefs are found. So coral reefs have certain characteristics that they like in order to grow. So corals like very high light. They like clear water, so this nice clear blue water here that you see in this photo. And in parentheses, it says for photosynthesis. I'll explain that in a minute. Corals are only found in salt water, so they like our oceans. You won't find true corals in lakes or ponds. They only like our oceans. And they have a thermal tolerance between 16 and 30 degrees Celsius. So they like these warmer waters around the equator. Now we'll see, I'll put my cursor here on Florida, which is about where I am right now, right about here. So you can see here in the orange, that's about where we are. So we do have coral reefs here in Florida. Now Florida has the world's third largest fringing reef system, and it's known as the Florida Reef Tract, or FRT for short. Now the Florida Reef Tract is 360 miles long, and it starts up here in Martin County, up here where my cursor is, and it goes all the way down through a couple of counties, down here through Miami, through the Florida Keys, and out towards the Dry Tortugas National Park. So that's 360 miles. Now, about 2/3 of this Florida Reef Tract is within managed areas. So here in Florida, we do a really good job of trying to take care of and manage our coral reefs so that we know a lot of the reef here in Florida is protected. So most of the reef here is within Biscayne National Park here near Miami, within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary here within this blue area, and then here in Dry Tortugas National Park. Now we also have some corals found here on the west coast of Florida. So where I'm sitting right here in St. Pete, Florida, here on the west coast, there are some coral species that are found in the Gulf of Mexico here in these orange area known as the West Florida Shelf. So even though it's not actually known to be part of the Florida Reef Tract, we do have some hard bottom areas that support corals in the Gulf of Mexico. So I wanted to give you an idea of some of the coral species that are found here in Florida. They come in all shapes and sizes and colors, seemingly not quite as colorful as some of the species found in the Pacific, but I love them just the same. We have really cool corals that look like brains. We have corals that have really large polyps, like these star corals or these flower corals. We have really cool corals like cactus corals. And some of my favorites are the elkhorn and the staghorn coral. So they look like antlers. And then a really cool coral that we have here that's on the endangered species list is the pillar coral. That here is called, the scientific name of this coral is called Dendrogyra. And it's one of the species that's on the endangered species list. So seeing these shapes and sizes and colors, something that I wanted to talk to you guys next is what actually gives a coral its color. So these four photos here actually shows you some of the different colors kind of closer up to some of the colors that are in corals here in Florida. But what is actually giving the corals that color is a single-celled algae called zooxanthellae, which I think is an absolutely crazy name for something that's so tiny that it can actually live within the tissue of those tiny little coral polyps. Now, those zooxanthellae play a really important part in the life of a coral because those zooxanthellae will photosynthesize just like a plant, and they make energy that they then provide to the coral as well as themselves. So they live within the tissues of the coral, they photosynthesize, and then they actually give some of that energy to the coral. Now that type of relationship is called symbiosis. Now symbiosis is a fancy word that basically when it breaks down, it means living together. And that type of symbiosis where both the coral benefits and the algae benefits is a mutualism. So the coral gets energy from the algae, and the algae actually gets a safe place to live and access to plenty of sunlight for photosynthesis. So that relationship is beneficial for both the coral and the zooxanthellae. There's lots of example of symbiosis on a reef. So anything from this turtle that uses these nice yellow tangs to pick little algae and bacteria off of its skin, or this fish getting cleaned by this other fish, or even an anemone that provides a home for these anemone fish. There's lots of symbiosis or other symbiotic relationships on a reef, but corals and zooxanthellae have a very important relationship. Now, corals, like I said, they get about 90% of their energy from that symbiotic relationship with that zooxanthellae. But like I said earlier, corals also have those nematocysts, so they can also feed on really small zooplankton. Now I'm going to try to play this video. Uh-oh, that did not work. See if we can do this again. Let's see. I'm going to fast forward it some. If you guys can see, watch these little tentacles here, and you'll actually see them pull in little zooplankton. Here you can see them moving really, really fast. So that's what they're doing, is they're actually pulling in little zooplankton. Uh-oh, okay, I restarted it. Okay. Well, okay. That's pretty much what I wanted to show you guys as far as that goes, except now I can't get out of it. Okay. Let's see. All right. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to talk about are, why are coral reefs important? Most importantly, reefs are important because they provide lots of habitat for lots of many other species on the reef. They provide habitat for fish and octopi and turtles and lobster and all of the other organisms that utilize those reefs. And that's really, really important because it provides food and lots of other resources. So in terms of food, for fisheries, even for humans, those fish and mollusks and crabs, lobsters, etc., that are found on the reefs, they feed between 30 and 40 million people every year. So just imagine if we did not have those coral reefs, that we wouldn't have food for 30 to 40 million people every year. Now, tourism is also very, very big. People travel all around the world to go snorkeling and scuba diving and fish on our coral reefs. And this tourism actually helps support local economy. Here in Florida, lots of people travel to our state in order to utilize our coral reefs and come in and swim and dive in our beautiful waters. But our coral reefs are in trouble. and coral cover has declined by 90% around the world. So here in this photo, you can see nice, healthy coral, and on the other side, you see coral that's been damaged and dying. So what's causing some of that die-off, first of all, is disease. So corals can get sick from bacteria and viruses, just like you and I can. And sometimes that's caused by either pollution or thermal stress. And some of that thermal stress can be caused by climate change, so the warming of the oceans. And that thermal stress can contribute to, like I said before, increased infectious diseases or coral bleaching. So that zooxanthellae that gives the coral that healthy color, so these green colors here, if the water gets too warm, that zooxanthellae may die off or may actually leave the tissue of these corals, leaving the corals looking bleached. So you'll see here this nice healthy green color, and then on the other side, once the zooxanthellae leaves, it's this bleached color. And if the temperature of the water doesn't cool down and the zooxanthellae doesn't return to the coral, often what can happen are these corals will eventually starve to death. And unfortunately, one of the main problems and one of the largest causes of stress to our corals, unfortunately, are us, people. So we cause damage to the reefs either through things like anchoring on the reef. Ship groundings cause major problems in shipping areas. Pollution, either through things like chemical compounds, either being dumped in the ocean or through things like harmful chemicals in our sunscreens. Coastal construction, dredging projects, things like that. The sedimentation from these projects can actually smother the corals. So there's lots of damage being caused to the coral reefs. But I wanted to talk to you about some of the things that FWC actually does for Florida's corals and our coral reefs. We do things like long-term monitoring to conduct surveys and evaluate the coral health and watch for changes over time. We allow permitting and review research and management related permitting requests. We conduct lots of research to provide technical support and research data to both state and federal governments. And we also provide certain types of rescue. For example, we've collected lots of corals that have been susceptible to certain types of diseases and provided those corals for a living gene bank to conserve those corals for future use in restoration. Now, for example, for our long-term monitoring, that monitoring actually documents the status of the coral reefs in the Florida Keys and the Dry Tortugas, as well as some work here on the west coast of Florida. We document things like changes in percent coral cover, so how much coral is out there, coral diversity, such as which species are present, and then the health of the coral communities. Are we seeing diseases or are the corals bleaching? And every year we return to the same sites so that we can look for those types of changes and look for long-term trends. All right, for coral rescue, one of those projects that I just kind of talked about, it was a really big project that we started 2 years ago, and it was in response to stony coral tissue loss disease. We actually collected 16 species, almost 2,000 coral colonies were collected, and we distributed those coral colonies to 19 zoos and aquariums across the United States. We have coral colonies in Nebraska, Texas, New Jersey, Michigan, South Carolina. We have them all across the United States. And those corals are actually going to serve as a living gene bank. So we'll actually breed those corals and use the offspring for restoration to help restore the reefs in the future. I'll actually skip those videos. So I've kind of talked to you about what FWC does to help protect the reefs, but a couple of things that you can actually do to help protect the reef is to use things like reef safe sunscreen or just cover up in the sun and not use harmful chemicals. You can reuse, reduce, and recycle. Follow fishing laws to help promote a healthy ecosystem on the reef. Practice safe anchoring or safe boating practices when you're out on the water. You can dispose of trash, especially your plastics, properly to help prevent trash from getting into our waterways. And most importantly, if you're ever out swimming or snorkeling on our reefs, make sure that you're not touching the corals. And with that, I wanted to give you a website. If you wanted to check out a website on FWC's online portal, you can look here for more information on coral reefs and the work that we do here with the coral team. So with that, I think I have a few minutes for questions, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
And we have another coral biologist joining us to maybe answer questions. Hi, Christina.
Hello.
Hi. So one common question we have from viewers, what does coral eat?
So most corals eat little zooplankton, so like tiny little shrimp, or, you know, a lot of them are so tiny, their polyps are so tiny that they're just little microscopic copepods or shrimp, tiny little crustaceans.
So maybe like a baby crab or
yes,
baby shrimp, like you said. Very interesting. Let's see, how do corals develop different colors?
So most of the coral, the color for a coral comes from the zooxanthellae. So there are lots of different species of zooxanthellae. So there are algae, and that algae will have different colors themselves. And all of that color comes through because in general, a coral tissue would be clear. And so all of that color comes from the algae itself.
Very interesting. And technically we only have 3 minutes left, but we can run a little bit over time here. So how big can corals get, which is a tough question, and how long do they live? Since there's so many different types of coral, Stephanie, how can we answer that?
So depending on the species, you know, some species get huge. You know, meters, like I've seen corals the size of a school bus, and that's one colony of coral the size of a school bus. And that coral colony, because they kind of just continue to grow and grow and grow on top of each other, like it just continuously grows. So it might have started 10,000 years ago. Some of these may even be 150,000 years old.
Wow, that is really, really neat. Corals are old. And that's why it's so important for them to be preserved, right? It takes a long time for them to grow big. Do fish eat corals? Do turtles eat corals? What kind of animals eat corals?
There are some animals that eat corals. There are some fish that eat corals. Butterfly fish will actually suck out individual little coral polyps. Things like parrotfish will also eat corals, but it's kind of a side effect. So parrotfish are actually going after the algae, and they'll eat coral accidentally. But you'll actually see kind of parrotfish eating the algae, and they'll eat the coral accidentally. But there are certain species of fish that will eat coral polyps. Damselfish and butterfly fish will eat coral polyps. Turtles do not eat corals. There are certain crabs that will eat corals, and there are two main coral predators that can be a problem here in Florida and the Caribbean. There is a type of snail that eats coral, and there is a fireworm that eats coral. So different types of invertebrates and fish will eat coral.
And we have several questions about clownfish. I'm guessing maybe because of Finding Nemo, and clownfish are notorious for living in sea anemones and not getting stung, right? So let's see, can clownfish live in coral reefs safely? Do any corals sting? Those are kind of related questions.
So all corals will sting. Most corals, I did say that they have those nematocysts, those stinging cells. Now for a human, their stinging cells aren't strong enough to actually hurt us as a human. But for other organisms, they would be strong enough. So certain fish or other organisms, they would be able to sting them and kind of keep them away from them. But fish are able to live within the branches or near a coral. So clownfish or other fish can live near a coral and often use coral as habitat. So they'll use the branches of a coral, and small little fish will hide within the branches of a coral and can, you know, stay away from larger fish just because the larger fish can't get in there to kind of catch the smaller fish. So it's kind of a small versus large, and then, you know, the stinging cells for us wouldn't cause a problem, but for certain organisms it would be, you know, strong enough, like those little shrimp or things that a coral would eat. Those nematocysts are strong enough to actually stun them and then allow the polyp to, you know, suck it in and actually eat them. So it all depends on which organism you're talking about as to whether or not they can safely, you know, touch a coral and not get stung.
So people are asking about reefs in Florida. Where can they see coral reefs in Florida, and specifically, does St. Petersburg have any coral reefs off the coast?
So St. Petersburg technically does not have coral reefs off the coast. We have hard bottom ledges. So there are like calcium carbonate deposits off the ledge. It's called the West Florida Shelf. So there's limestone shelves or hard bottom ledges, and those ledges will actually support species of coral. And so we were actually out diving yesterday on some of these hard bottom ledges. So they're super popular areas for people to go fishing. So they're not technically places, because they're pretty far offshore, not really places that people could go and like snorkel very easily here in St. Pete. But off the east coast of Florida, there's lots of places to go snorkeling and actually see coral reefs. I've been shore snorkeling or shore diving off of Deerfield Beach and Pompano Beach, right there near Boca Raton or Fort Lauderdale. There's a couple of really cool places to snorkel in Miami, but if you go down to the Florida Keys, anywhere in the Pennycamp State Park, there's really great snorkeling to see the Florida reefs in the Keys. If you're able to get out on a boat, lots of great snorkeling or diving. The Florida Keys are probably some of the best areas to go snorkeling and diving and see our coral reefs. Or if you can get out to the Dry Tortugas and go to Dry Tortugas National Park, the most pristine coral reefs in Florida are in the dry tortugas. So really great snorkeling opportunities on the east coast of Florida for sure.
There's so much to learn about corals. One more question here. Have you ever seen a new species of coral that you've never seen before, and did you take it back to the lab to study it?
I like, or you think they're asking if I've ever seen, like, found a new species that I've never seen or that's never been discovered before? Let's see, if I mean, I feel like every time I go snorkeling or diving, I always see something new, whether it's a different color of a coral that I haven't seen or something like that. I've lived in Hawaii, and I've actually been lucky enough to go diving around the Pacific Ocean, and I've been to Australia. So I've been to some really amazing places, and I've been diving and snorkeling around the world, and I've seen new things every time I go snorkeling and diving. So, you know, there's always something new that I get to see. I'm always, unless I'm there for work and I have a permit to do a collection and there is a reason for me to bring an organism back to the lab to study it, I like to leave things where they are. That's the most important thing to do when you see something in the wild, is to make sure that you're leaving it in its habitat, where it lives and where it's going to be able to, you know, maintain its health and be part of its environment. You know, it's part of a coral reef, and it needs to stay there rather than me taking it back to the lab to study it. So I would rather study it on the reef than bring it back to the lab. You know, I talked about coral rescue, but that was a very specific project that we had to do in order to kind of maintain the genetic diversity of the Florida Reef Tract. And it was, you know, a very maintained and organized project. So, you know, my way of doing things is to always keep organisms in their wild habitat, because that's where they belong, first of all. So
Stephanie, thanks so much for sharing all of your very vast knowledge about corals and coral reefs. We definitely enjoyed the interesting photos and videos, and we thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and for the great questions. Thank you so much, and we will see you later.